Have a few folks signed up to testify. Obviously, I'll just say it for the record. If you haven't signed up and wish to testify, please do so. And first, we will start with Andrew Marsh. Mr. Marsh, if you want to come up and testify.
Thank you, co-chairs Diane and Keenan, for allowing me to testify on S2278, an act relative to the protection of propane gas ratepayers. My name is Andrew Marsh, and I'm a resident of Oxford. Senator Moore and I created this proposal in January 2014 when my sister and brother-in-law received a bill for a routine propane delivery from Oxford Propane. We learned that the rate per gallon had increased by just shy of 20%. There was no notification of this increase before the delivery was made, and the total dollar change in the bill was much more than we'd anticipated. There are many in the Commonwealth that would really struggle with such an unanticipated increase. The 790,000 Massachusetts residents living in poverty would be forced to make cuts that are equally as vital, like food, electricity, and mortgage or rent, in order to pay for vital heat and fuel that they now can't return. This measure would allow residents across the Commonwealth to better handle such increases by giving timely notification between the price hike and the actual delivery so they could adjust their budgets accordingly or look for fuel elsewhere. As an added bonus, consumers would feel more confident in their ability to contribute to local economies, which would spur economic growth. I've heard criticisms that this new regulation is unnecessary since some companies already post their prices online. And for those that do notify their customers in some way, I applaud them for taking the initiative. However, for those that don't, the customer base is left with an irreversible financial disadvantage, since propane gas can't be returned and refunded like other supplies can. In addition, if a consumer is in a contract to get an automatic delivery of propane, then they're in all honesty not likely to check the most recent price on a regular basis. Passing this measure would create a level playing field for every consumer and help to give those who are just barely getting by a fighting chance. Thank you, co-chairs. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Marsh, for your testimony. Any questions from members of the committee? So, in your case, it was your automatic delivery?
My sister and my brother-in-law, who I lived with at the time, I now live with my parents in the same town in the same precinct, just a couple miles, couple streets down.
Mm-hmm. And so they were on automatic delivery at the time?
Yes.
And do you know if the company that they received the delivery from, as you said, did they provide price information on that?
I do not know if they did at the time. I just found out that some did from when I was talking about this idea in a casual conversation with one of my relatives who disagreed with it, and he brought that up.
Thank you very much for that. And we have a few other folks who are going to testify today, but if we have additional questions, we'll make sure to follow up.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next, we have Jim Blake, the Eastern
Propane Gas Association of New England, and I'm joined by Jim Blake of Eastern Propane, who's also a member of our association, and we're here in opposition to Senate Bill 2278. With that, I'd like to introduce Jim, who's a district manager for Eastern Propane, and as I said before, also a member of the association. Jim.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Jim Blake, thank you, Bill. I do work at Eastern Propane. I'm also a resident of Danvers, Mass. Propane consumer as well as I work in the industry, and I've been involved in the industry for over 30 years. I've been fortunate enough to work with the Marshal's office in helping to draft regulations within the Commonwealth and work and do continuing ed and a number of different things to help support the Commonwealth and the industry. But I just wanted to take a couple of points, and I understand the Marsh's concern, and he had mentioned returning product and so forth, and although the product does go into a tank, in Massachusetts there are hundreds of propane companies, some from 1 or 2 employees to other larger companies that have hundreds of employees. And the customary practice for most companies is to refund product in the tank. And it's usually outlined in their standard terms and conditions that are shared with all consumers. I will tell you, some companies refund the whole thing, some require a restocking charge, just like returning any item. But there are standard terms and conditions used by a majority, if not, I would say a majority of all the companies within the Commonwealth. And they are encouraged, all the members of our association are encouraged to do that because it lays out many things. And that's one of the things about the automatic renewal clause that's in many agreements, not just in the propane industry, but I come from other industries and it's a standard practice. I actually talked to a landlord this morning, a friend of mine, and he said, you know, he has the same thing in his agreements because what it does is those protect all the clauses in the agreement. There's clauses in there, in the case of propane, the companies own the equipment in over 95% of the cases. Less than 5% of the people in the Commonwealth own their own propane tank and equipment. So the companies are responsible for the regulating, keeping up with the regulations, maintaining maintenance and so forth, and doing repairs if required on those containers. These clauses protect rights of access. They protect the consumer's rights in doing business with the customer. Everything that's outlined in the standard terms and conditions that's used in the industry falls under the automatic renewal clause, not just pricing. Pricing changes on a daily basis. Propane is a commodity like fuel oil, frankly, like milk and butter. It changes just like if you could go to the grocery store, the prices could fluctuate based on different things that happen anywhere in the country or anywhere in the world. People do have programs where you can pre-purchase propane for a period of time at a fixed rate to ensure that you don't have certain fluctuations. They also have budget programs to spread things out, just like, frankly, fuel oil dealers and many utilities, you know, offer budget programs, all that kind of stuff. It's a customer service type business, so there's many programs out there for people to be able to take liberty of. Additionally, there's, as I said, hundreds of companies in the Commonwealth, so consumers are not tied to one company. And companies generally work together when somebody wants to change providers, because consumers have a right to choose who they want in their system. Frankly, that's really my points, and I'd like to thank you very much for the time, and I do urge you to consider this when you're considering the bill and to vote against it. Thank you. And I have a letter, I'll just leave you that kind of synopsis.
I'd like to follow it up with some brief testimony here, and I am not Joe Rhodes, who's the president and CEO, but he gave me testimony he would like me to read, but I'll paraphrase if I can, very briefly. Sorry, my old eyes here. Right now, there are currently 161 Massachusetts-based companies who are members of the Propane Gas Association. These members employ companies, thousands of Massachusetts citizens who sell propane and propane accessories to Massachusetts consumers. And propane sales in 2013 in Massachusetts alone amounted to over 129 million gallons. His concerns specifically are to subparagraph B, and those I just want to read his brief comments on this. The vast majority of propane sold is sold at the market price, herein referred to as the variable rate. As a commodity like other fuels, gasoline, fuel oil, diesel, the price of the commodity changes daily. Just this past winter, during a time of extremely heavy demand, propane prices rose dramatically overnight. Over the course of 3 days, the wholesale commodity price in Conway, Kansas, the second largest pricing hub in the U.S., quadrupled. This could have happened at New England supply points as well. My point here is that members do not know what the price is on delivery until a couple of days prior to, and to require 15 days written notice is not only impossible to comply with, but would add huge additional costs to providers that would ultimately be passed on to consumers. I'm aware that consumers were upset about price increases last winter, but as an industry, I counseled the retailers that they needed to secure product to keep consumer tanks filled and consumers safe and warm in their homes, even at somewhat higher prices. This was preferable to them running out of fuel. Most consumers sign up with a provider without a term of service and have the right to change providers if they are dissatisfied. Unlike a utility, propane companies compete for the business that they have and must continuously earn the business and from their customers. I strongly urge you to vote down Senate Bill 2278 and let the free markets continue to work. That's by behalf of Joe Rose, the President and CEO of the Propane Gas Association of New England.
Thank you, Blake, for your testimony. Before we ask a few questions, just like to recognize we've been joined by Representative Walter Timothy, to my far left, in between there, Representative Kathy Chin, and Representative Moore. By way of question, actually, I'll just ask the member if they have questions before. Representative here.
So the customer owns, does not own the equipment, the company owns the equipment. In the case of like a homeowner, if they heat with propane, obviously heating equipment is owned by the customer, right? And then the propane company owns the tanks outside.
In a customarily, yes. I mean, in
95%
over 95% of the time, consumers have the right to purchase a tank, but owning a tank comes with certain responsibilities and legal requirements.
So if the propane company owns the tank, obviously only that company can fill that tank, right?
Correct, due to liability, yes.
Through liability, but also he has to have heat every day. If his tank is low, he has to call you. And he's kind of at your mercy on that day to buy the propane from you. He has to buy from that company that owns the tank, right?
No, he doesn't, because what happens is, if they, and I can guarantee you this happens more than companies care, is that, for instance, a consumer decides not to pay a bill, they will call another company that will come in and install a tank and deliver fuel.
Yeah, that would take time. The tank is empty, they have to have heat.
Right, but people do that in a matter of hours at times. Once the initial installation's in place, you can usually, it depends on the size of the tank, but I'm talking on a typical installation. It can, it's done in less than a couple hours.
So the customer can call you, say my tank is empty, you can get a price quote from you that day.
Absolutely, yes.
If he doesn't like that price, he can call another company.
Correct.
But yours would have to be removed and the new company's installed before he goes to another company.
Yes,
Correct?
normally.
Doesn't that take a few days to have that occur? I mean,
Depends how quick the other company can react.
or how quick you remove your tank, right?
Yes. Companies generally, there's always exceptions, but companies generally all work together. If there's a situation, where somebody there are certain tanks that maybe can't be removed because something's happened or whatever, companies will typically transfer those assets between companies, okay, through purchase and sale agreements.
I'm just trying to recognize,
Yeah.
potential hardship on the part of the homeowner. He's got your tank, and another guy's selling propane for say 10% less, and he wants to go to the other company, but he can't because your tank is there. Is there anything stopping from having two tanks, two different companies, or do you have to have an exclusive contract with the homeowner?
Maybe I explain first that it's propane tanks, different from oil tanks and so forth.
Propane, right.
That these are under pressure too, and only certified people can actually make the connection to them, to fill them and so forth. So it's a different scenario, situation than just going in and inviting someone else to come in and fill it. They have to, make sure they're in compliance with the law and the regulations as far as filling the tank.
Right.
But no, just to get back to your question, to make sure I understand it, it's about the process of, can you have two tanks on the same property?
Two separate companies.
You could. You wouldn't have it tied into the same system, and the reason is because of safety hazards that are tied to that. Now, the consumer has the option to purchase the tank. They do have that right, okay? There are some companies that only do business selling a container to a customer. That's their business model. Same like, it's very much like the fuel oil business, okay, other than the gas company supplies the tank. But you could call up, and if you have a rate, say you get quoted a rate that's 10% lower, you can certainly approach that company with that and give them the option as well. You don't have to be on automatic delivery. As you said, you can will call for your deliveries. You know, automatic deliveries typically is service.
Okay, thanks.
Nope.
Any further questions? You mentioned in your testimony, Mr. Blake, that, or maybe in your testimony that you read, Bill, that 15 days was too much notice, but that prices are relatively stable within a few days around delivery. Is there any standard in the sense that do you feel like you started not? Could a customer be reasonably expected to know that it would be 72 to 96 hours before delivery?
If a customer wanted to ensure that, they could enter into a purchase agreement where they would guarantee to buy a fixed number of gallons at a predetermined rate, okay, like a pre-buy, just with same as with fuel oil and so forth. And the dealers are obligated to back that up, you know, under state law as well. You have to do it, but that's a contract, it's an agreement. If a consumer or the company chooses to float with the market, then we're subject to the market changes. Propane is similar to oil in that commodity pieces, and I've been in the business over 30 years. Generally, pricing doesn't change at the supply point, okay, more than once a day, but I've seen it change in that period of time. I have seen it change, as we've seen with fuel oil, had it change more than once in a day. But typically it's a daily market. It changes and fluctuates on a daily standard. And so it's supply. New England itself has a supply infrastructure that is difficult, more difficult than other parts of the company, because the pipeline that serves this area terminates in Selkirk, New York. They're working to increase storage out there, and dealers are working to increase storage as well, but the product is either trucked in or comes by rail. And then we do have 2 import terminals in both Providence, Rhode Island, and Newington, New Hampshire. And the import terminals, right now, currently the foreign market is approximately double what the domestic cost is for product. And as an example, New England cannot survive. Last year, that was one of the things that created the major increase, is there was not enough supply in the country to cover what happened out in the Midwest. And the U.S. is the largest producer of propane. So foreign product had to be brought into New England, which created a major spike last winter in that.
If a customer were to call a week in advance, call 3 days in advance, and say, can you tell me what the prices are now? Obviously, they're going to be able to get that, but it won't be what they're then taking the risk, right, of whether or not that'll hold over the next few days, right? So it's not as if they can't get that information if they were to call it in, but it isn't that it's locked in unless they get into a contractual arrangement like you highlighted, right?
Doug, 2 answers. One would be on a technical standard, yes, they should be in agreement. However, I can speak for how I operate my business. I can also speak for how most of the people I compete directly against manage their business. And if a consumer called up and was working on, trying to set a price and a budget, we're talking about an individual consumer. You could make a deal with that consumer, you can honor that price. It's one consumer. The problem is we're dealing with millions of gallons And to make a rule that affects millions of gallons is much different than dealing with an individual consumer. And you could certainly make a deal with a specific consumer and frankly, deliver it 2 weeks from now. In the scope of the business, it's not going to.
It's a very competitive business overall, and they are competing. And as Mr. Marsh said in his testimony, a lot of them do post their prices right online, so they can just check it online first rather than make a call. So, but it's, I won't say cutthroat, but it's pretty close to it between competing businesses.
There's I will tell you that with what's happened, in the Commonwealth and nationally, the increase in trying to use green fuels, which propane is an environmentally friendly, it's a green fuel, it doesn't contaminate the ground or the air. A lot of the fossil fuel, like fuel oil, which has a very high carbon content and so forth, the regulations, and I handle both products, but the regulations definitely do not favor people using fuel oil anymore. So many dealers that historically handled fuel oil are now expanding into the propane market as well. So because the base of companies is expanding every year within the Commonwealth. So the competitiveness of the industry increases right now every year.
I don't have any more questions. If the members don't have any more questions, certainly there have been some interesting issues brought up and something we need to dig a little bit more into. But we appreciate the testimony of Mr. Marsh. Certainly appreciate the testimony of Mr. Blake and Mr. Malloy. Obviously, my co-chair, John McKean, was unable to be here today, so we'll need to discuss the issue and the recommendation from the chairs for future action. But I think it's an issue we'd like to dig into some more. So thank you all for coming. And the committee will be in touch with the members with a recommendation for action in the not too distant future.